Guten Tag, WAP. This is Mr. Liniger. Let's make history today as we go over Unit 2, Day 9. Today we're going to go over Iberian colonization of Latin America and its social and economic effect. And we'll talk about European exploitation of the Americas. But let's get started with our daily punishment. The Middle Ages were called the Dark Ages because there were too many knights there. It's history and it's world history. Oh, look, it's Middle Ages, Dark Ages, knights. Key terms for today: San Juan Diego, the Virgin of Guadalupe, mercantilism, haciendas, the casta system, peninsulares, creoles, mestizos, mulattos, zambos, the French and Indian War, also known as the 7 Years' War, spoiler, Bourbon reforms, the Pueblo Revolt, and the Stono Revolt, or Stono Rebellion. We're going to talk about economic characteristics of Iberian-controlled Latin America, the new racial social structure, the casta system, the changes in religion in Latin America, and revolts in Latin America. So let's start off with economics. Silver is going to be more plentiful than gold, and they will find a lot of it in the Americas. This is going to be the basis of Spanish New World wealth. There's going to be two major sites of silver mining, Zacatecas in Mexico and Potosi in Peru. This silver is going to have a huge global significance. 1/5 of the world's silver will come from the Spanish treasury from their discovery of the New World. This will pay for all the Spanish military and bureaucracy. It will be passed on to European and Asian markets. It also helps lead to the price revolution and causes inflation. Other than that, the Spanish Americas were primarily agrarian. They had large plantations or haciendas, coastal plantations. They produced cash crops, that they would make that were for wealth, luxury crops like sugar, cocoa, coffee, later things like cotton. Eventually, this will require a large import of African slaves. For Iberia, for Spain and Portugal, they're going to be very mercantilistic. They were not capitalistic. They do have a textile industry in the Americas. They'll get woolens from sheep ranching. They'll develop a leather industry from cattle. Cotton will be produced locally by Indians. They'll also be woven by them. In Portugal will create Brazil, which will be a sugar colony. The colonial life in Brazil will revolve around the sugar mill or the engenho. Brazil will rely heavily on slave labor. There will be a gold discovery in Brazil, which will lead to a gold rush. Rancheros or cowboys will move to Central American plains and they'll become sheep herders in South America. Let's talk a little bit about the racial makeup. Spain and Portugal will create a racial-based society, kind of similar to the caste system, although there's no religion tied to this. In the top class, you have the peninsulares. They were whites born in Europe. And then you have the Creoles, whites born in America, the mestizos, a mix of whites and Amerindians, the mulattoes, a mix of white and African Americans, the Zambos, a mix of Amerindians and African Americans, the Amerindians and the African Americans. There will be some racial anger later on, and when the Latin American countries declare independence, it will actually be led by the Creoles, who were unhappy that all the good jobs went to the peninsulares. In North American societies, there's greater gender balance amongst settlers, so like you'd have white women and men marrying each other. The French people did marry the native women, and they created their own métis, or mixed races. The English were the least likely to do interracial marriages. They considered it distasteful and going native, quote unquote. Let's talk about the religious developments in Latin America. Spanish missionaries will introduce Catholicism. They'll create missionaries all over Central, North, and South America. The missionaries will record the languages and traditions of the Amerindians. They'll taught the Indians skill, farming, and herding. The church over time will become the protector of the Amerindians, although they did exploit them at first. Over time, a lot of the Amerindians will convert to Roman Catholicism. One of the first people to convert and the first Amerindian that became a Catholic saint was Juan Diego. In 1451, he claimed the Virgin Mary appeared to him. She had darker skin and she appeared in Guadalupe, so she's called the Virgin of Guadalupe. She's still like one of the national symbols of Mexico. When she appeared to him, she was shown a sign crushing the snake, which is one of the symbols of the Aztecs, and she has become a symbol for the Mexico people. The French and the English were a lot less successful. We mentioned this multiple times. The English had little interest in converting the Native Americans. They would just do prayer towns where they would send them to an English village and read them the Bible in English. The French missionaries will be active, but there wasn't as many French people as there were Spanish in the New World, so they only have modest success. The native religion will survive, but it's going to often go underground, disguise. Sometimes the Native American religion will blend with Roman Catholicism. So in the Americas, they have a lot of the big things they have is veneration of the saints, like multiple Catholic saints. And part of that is because of the Aztec and Inca polytheism. They've kind of adopted the cult of the saints from their previous polytheistic beliefs. So there was some syncretism. The Catholic Church and the royal government were allies. They'll establish churches, schools, and towns in frontier areas. They'll ran many areas of the social and intellectual activities of the colonies. The church will help to stimulate intellectual growth. They'll create the first printing presses to do church business. The first universities will be church-run. And when they colonize the New World, they will create the Inquisition, and they'll go after Protestants, Jews, heretics, anybody that dissents from Roman Catholicism. Let's talk about some of the reforms that the Spanish and Portuguese tried to make. The Spanish will do a series of reforms called the Bourbon Reforms. The king will be moved by economic nationalism to create more centralization. He'll start granting monopolies and royal charters. He'll liberalize trading guidelines, allow a little bit more capitalism, and kind of some proto-joint stock companies. The Spanish king was upset that the Jesuits were defending the Native Americans, so he'll basically take them out of power in the New World. They're going to focus on better defense, military arrangements, and they'll settle in new areas like California, Chile, and Texas. Portugal will also do its own series of reforms called the Pompal Reforms. They'll pursue more mercantilism, autocratic reform from the top down. Brazil will be the center of the reform policies. They'll create monopolies in Brazil to exploit the areas. They'll do a huge exploitation and importation of African slaves to work in Brazil. And they also will restrict the church influence so that they could use and abuse the Indians and the African slaves. The big war that happens in the Americas, like we talked about, is the French and Indian War, also known as the 7 Years' War. As a result of this, England will defeat the French. It's called the French and Indian War, but it's really England versus France. The Indians, for the most part, were treated better by the French, so a lot of them did support the French, which will be problematic when the English win. England will get control over Canada and India, and England will become the world dominant power. At the very end of this unit, some Americans will start to resent royal government. We'll see tax revolts, and we'll see that in the 13 colonies, like the Stamp Act, the Tea Act, the Sugar Act, and all these like revolts, like the Boston Tea Party, for example. There will be slave revolts, and we'll talk about that in a second. There'll be revolts against mercantilism. An example of a revolt is Tupac Amora was one of the last descendants of the Incas. He's going to lead a revolt in Peru in 1783 to try to reestablish the Inca dynasty, and he will be crushed. But a lot of the people in this area, starting with the 13 colonies, will be upset about the mercantilism that the mother country is putting on the colonies and forcing them only to trade with them. So this will set the stage for revolutions, like the American Revolution. And some specific examples of revolts. An example of a native revolt of Amerindians was the Pueblo Revolt. This was in New Mexico in 1680. They're going to kill 400 Spanish, the Amerindians will, and the first thing they just do is they destroy all the Catholic churches. They saw the Catholic Church as a symbol of oppression. There also will be slave revolts in this time. Later on, when we get to next unit, there's bigger slave revolts like Nat Turner, Gabriel Vesey, John Brown's slave revolt. But even as early as 1739, we have the first major slave revolt in South Carolina called the Stono Revolt. Between 25 to 50 whites will be killed. This is going to frighten a lot of white people in the South that the slaves are going to rebel, especially in some deep South states where there's more slaves than there are whites. So as a result, slave states are going to start passing slave codes or slave laws that are going to make it more strict. Before this time, some African slaves, like their children, might be free, but the new slave laws that are going to start to be passed, the black codes, are going to be like, your kids are slaves also. You cannot teach slaves how to read. Literacy is illegal. And it's going to just make it much more strict and inhumane. Basically, give the slave owner permission to do whatever he wants to the slave. All right, guys, that is all I have for today. We will be going over the Ottoman Empire and the Gunpowder Empires the next couple of videos. Until next time, deuces. Deuces, yeah.